Hopefully you're all here for Nobody is Listening to Your Phone Calls, Really? A debate and discussion on the NSA's activities. And I'm introduce Mark J. Cox and Jamil Jaffer.
Hey, thanks guys. I'm Mark J. Cox. I'm with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been working with the EFF for the past couple of years on national security issues, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and a lot of computer security, cybersecurity related bills in Congress. For those who were following their printed materials, we had a substitution, and graciously, unfortunately, Michael couldn't make it, and Jamil Jaffer is here instead. And I'm going to give him a few minutes to introduce himself, where he's coming from, and what he does. And take it away, Jamil.
Great, thanks. The microphone's not on. Is the mic on? Can you all hear me? All right, I got a pretty loud voice anyway, so I'll try without the mic, but if we get the mic on from the AV folks, that'd be awesome. So my name is Jamil Jaffer. I currently work in the U.S. Senate, and as a part-time job, I also work at George Mason University School of Law as the director of their Homeland and National Security Law program. Prior to working in the Senate, I worked at the House Intelligence Committee, doing among other things NSA oversight, and also helped draft the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, also known as CISPA. So I'm excited to be here, and I previously worked at the Justice Department in the White House in the Bush administration. So I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to chatting with you guys about NSA and the surveillance efforts that are ongoing. And take it away.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Jamil. So this talk is going to assume, in this debate, we'll assume a base level knowledge about some of the NSA activities revealed. And I'm going to go over a few of them, which will probably be the main points of discussion, and especially the three revealed programs that we know of. And so I'll try and do this a little quickly. I apologize to the people who are already in the know and know this very well. But just quickly, the first section, one of the first leaks, one of the first releases had to do with Section 215 of the Patriot Act. And this was the Verizon order that was released by the Guardian that had an order mandating the release of all Americans' customer records from Verizon Business Solutions. It was later confirmed that by the government that this is sent to various other telephone companies, although still as yet unnamed. And so this is one of the first major leaks that happened, and it's actually one of the leaks, one of the releases, one of the programs that is being addressed by the USA Freedom Act, which was just introduced a couple of weeks ago, reintroduced. So that's one of the first programs that we'll be talking about, will be the focus on. The second part deals with Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that's one of the main surveillance laws, one of the main intelligence laws that the government uses to obtain internet communications, email communications, and physical searches as well. And so Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act has two programs, and these were two collection techniques that were released about a week after the Section 215 program, the calling records program or business records program, depending on who you speak to. Those are all colloquialisms for it. And so Section 702, it was released that Section 702 had two aspects of it. One aspect was this PRISM, and I'm sure many of you are aware of the PRISM slides from the Washington Post. And this program is a program where the government will send, I guess we'll take a step back a little bit and explain the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and how it works. It was originally passed in 1978, where you had the government, in light of a lot of the controversy and a lot of the catastrophe, especially around Watergate, passed a law that created a regime for spying on U.S. citizens abroad and individuals in the United States. And you had to show a probable cause. You had to show suspicion and probable cause that they were an AFP, an agent of a foreign power or a spy. In 2008, the law was updated to create a regime where the government files targeting procedures. Oh, there we go. Sorry. No problem. It created a regime where the government would file targeting procedures with a court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Courts, talking about broad categories and groups, countries, people who groups and countries who they thought would provide foreign intelligence. Once the targeting procedures are approved by the court, the government is then free to send individual certifications, they're called, and individual orders straight to the companies without discussing with the court the individual target or the specific selector. And a selector is a term we're going to be using probably throughout this. And it has been referred and means an email address, a telephone number. It's unclear if that could also mean a malware signature code, for instance, or an IP address, right? It's supposed to be, and it has been said, at least in a lot of the transcripts, that it is an email and a telephone number. So that's how Section 702 works. The PRISM program is a program where they're filing off these certifications to the companies, and the companies will then send back a response to the government. And the responses will include the selector, will include the target that the government orders the company to reveal. The second part is upstream, and it's probably we'll probably focus a little bit more on that, but upstream collection is collection off the backbone and off the fiber by the government as the communications transport and as the communications go along the fiber. And so these are kind of the three main collection authorities that we'll be discussing that has been released. It's really important to note that while these three are the known ones, there are other collection authorities, right? There's something called Executive Order 12333, which is part of the president's constitutional power, right, to spy. The EO 12333 is the regulations and sets up a policy framework for cribbing the president and creating regulations around what the spying under EO 12333 can and cannot do. And so those are kind of, that's a broad overview of what we'll be talking about, what's been released. And so that's like, hopefully provides a very good grounding for you guys. So now I'm going to move into kind of my, argument and my stance on a lot of this and what I think most of you came here to see. And so I'm going to be arguing mainly, today I'm going to be discussing at least why NSA signals intelligence policies and procedures and what we've learned about their signals intelligence collection systems is bad policy. It's bad economic policy, it's bad foreign policy, it's bad domestic policy. And underlying my argument, it'll come out, it'll evolve, but underlying my argument is, the NSA is split into two parts, right? One part of the NSA deals with signals intelligence and it deals with exploitation and exfiltration. The other part of the NSA deals with the cryptologic side, securing our networks and protecting our networks. And so, underlying this argument is that I think we have veered far too much towards the signals intelligence side and far too much towards our neglecting the cryptologic side. And I think we need to reorient towards a better balance between the two. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and what I'm doing. So I'll jump into the domestic policy. And at least for the domestic policy, my big fear is that we are going to have a world with neither, with no security and no privacy as a result of these things. And it's particularly around our computer security, our cyber security. We've seen the weakening of key encryption standards. We've seen, we have seen at least, NIST pulling dual Ekberg, and we have seen a lot of actions when it comes to fundamental items around our daily use of encryption and our daily use of the internet and things like that. It's a huge cost-benefit analysis that the NSA is doing, and I think what's been revealed, and especially around the fundamental encryption standards, it's a cost-benefit analysis that may seem a little out of whack when we're damaging at the fundamental level of the internet, at the fundamental level at these standards. We've also seen kind of this interdiction, right, where the NSA will intercept a package being sent from a U.S. manufacturer to a given target to install its hardware. And it's these offensive hacking operations that are creating massive security vulnerabilities. And at an expense where we are all, I think many people are uncertain, and there are a lot of jokes, right? Is your flash drive corrupted now, or where are these? To what extent is the NSA doing this, and where are these vulnerabilities? I think we need to know some of them, right? When one particular example is a program, called Genie, where the NSA is controlling, at least this was in 2011, one of the documents, the NSA is controlling over 100,000 computers. And, we trust that those 100,000 computers are targets and are valid targets, but it's a lot of computers. It's a lot of data that's being exfiltrated to the NSA. And that was only in 2011. In 2008, that number was at 20,000. In 2011, it was at 100,000. And so, where are we going? And at least I think the path where we're going is definitely something we need to be concerned about, and it's difficult, right? And when it comes to security research, it's a cliche and it's cheesy to say, but right, a rising tide does lift all boats. It does protect us to know some of these things. It does protect us, and the public has a right to know on many of these topics to secure our networks and to secure our computers. Kind of the second point, so that underlies kind of favoring the SIGINT side, right? We've seen just the signals intelligence side dominate the conversation at the NSA and dominate many of its actions, if not many of its actions. The second kind of point to this is that all these programs we've seen a shift from targeted surveillance to mass surveillance. And I think there's a big fear, and I think one of the arguments to touch on and look at is the over-reliance on big data and predictive analytics and your Hadoop, right? Sometimes, or it is very difficult to have a perfect big data analytics system, and we've seen that time and time again in the NSA revelations. And I think this reliance on big data and the reliance on this mass surveillance is at the expense of traditional investigative techniques. And I'll touch on that a little bit later when we talk about the efficacy of the programs. So we're amassing this information, and I think a big fear is that we're going to be neglecting traditional investigatory techniques. A really good example, and one of the examples is the Section 215 program, where we had a lot of examples. It was one of the few programs where the government gave us very clear examples. And in a lot of the cases, when it came to thwarting terrorist plots, a lot of the work done was by the everyday agent just looking at the phone calls and subpoenaing records and things like that. He did not need all of Verizon's phone calls to figure out this chaining. And so, we often hear that we need these programs, we need this mass surveillance because we're trying to find a needle in a haystack. And I think there's just too much hay. And part of that relies on a lot of the numbers we've seen come across on just the sheer amount of communications that are being collected, right? Under the PRISM program, these numbers are 2011, and for just the first half of 2011, the PRISM program collected over 250 million communications. Upstream collected around 14 million. And it was reflected in a recent Washington Post article that looked at the post-analysis documents. This came out a couple months ago by Bart Gellman and a few other reporters, and it looked at the number of Americans' information that was in this pile, and we know little about this pile, right? So we do know that it's post-collection, it's post-analysis, it's not just raw signals intelligence data. But they found two key things. One was that nearly half of the surveillance files were considered by the NSA to contain the communications of American residents or citizens, and that only around 10% of the communications captured belonged to foreigners who could be legally targeted, with the rest belonging to foreigners and Americans who were not targets of surveillance, right? And so that is excuse me?
Do you want to do questions now or after?
We're going to, so I should also caveat it, my apologies, that at the end of this we will have questions. And I think we're going to probably be reserving about, at least the last 20, 25 minutes for questions. So I'm going to hurry up a little bit because I've been a little long-winded in this. So that's kind of at least how much hay there is, and it seems to be that there is too much hay, and something that I think Jamil has some great insight on. So at least for the conclusion along domestic policy, right? There are kind of these 3 points that I keep coming back to, and one is that we've hindered our own computer security. We're relying on this collected all mentality with too much hay, and we're not finding the needles. We're not really, at least when it comes to lots of Section 215 program, we aren't really using it to thwart terrorist threats or to stop terrorist threats. And so I'll move on to kind of the economic policy. And I'll try and do this a little quickly. So the economic policy, I think, especially for folks in this room, it has been pretty disastrous, right? We have seen companies report left and right about lower sales. We have seen estimates across the board. I mean, the numbers are across the board as to how much money the United States tech industry could lose. I think Forrester came up with around, through 2016, came up with around 100-something billion dollars, which seems to be on the really extreme high end. And then you had the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation come with around 20 to $35 billion. And so, the loss is there, and it's something that keeps on reoccurring, right? In a 10K, in one of the financial calls that Cisco had, this is one of the key points that they made in their calls. They saw sales drop by 10 to 12% in Brazil. They saw other sales drop in Germany. And so the impact is there. You can't keep a secret forever. And we need to be more judicious kind of in our decisions when it comes to this exploitation, when it comes to impacting US companies. And secondly, economic policy isn't just the national economy, right? I'm going to stretch my definition of economic policy and also include our budget for intelligence agencies. And there are two numbers in particular that I just want to throw out there that speak to the fact that we may be focusing too heavily on SIG and that we haven't really reoriented, and we do need to reorient towards cryptologic side. And those two numbers are found in the black budget. And this is the budget for the intelligence community. It had never been released before. What was released, at least starting a few years ago, were top-line numbers. And so Stephen Aftergood of the Federation of American Scientists does a really good, he's one of the leaders in transparency around government intelligence activities. And top-line numbers did occur, but this was the first time where we actually saw line items into the intelligence agency. And two of the numbers that really stick out is that $400 million, almost $500 million, is focused solely on just managing the tasking systems and the mission. So just managing that aspect of it. The second item that consists of, or the second issue, the second kind of fact and number that I have is that the top three budget items, they include facilities and logistics, enterprise management, and enterprise IT system, total about 40% of the NSA's annual budget. And so those, at least from the descriptions in the black budget, seem to appear and seem to have little to do with the core mission of SIG and collection. They are mostly dealing with upkeep, right, and keeping the systems alive, but not with the actual exfiltration and COO and SSO departments. So it's two numbers that I think that we should ponder and think about in regards to how much money we're actually spending on the signals intelligence side and what we're doing there. And so that kind of rounds out the economic policy and economic side of things. Is it smart resource management? We've seen money loss to businesses, we've seen reputational damage to companies, and we've seen a loss of our tech leadership, right? Other nations are now much more skeptical of US tech companies. And so lastly, I'll end with the international policy ramifications and kind of our foreign policy and how the NSA has impacted that, and give examples as to why the NSA has been bad policy for that. And really, I can do this quickly where, we are seeing data localization laws now. We are seeing really balkanization of the internet. Norway, Brazil, Germany, Russia has a recent law where they're now forcing servers or an office in the country and are moving contracts away from US cloud providers and US cloud services, which were the leading nation and one of the leading nations. And trade agreements, we've seen the EU-US safe harbor privacy principles threatened and potentially maybe reworked. And most importantly, our U.S. internet freedom agenda. The State Department has been out there when it comes to our internet freedom agenda. And at the UN level, we have just seen the U.S. falling away as a leader and countries countries shifting towards plans to, again, balkanize the internet, shying away from U.S. proposals around the internet. And even crazy proposals like there was a Russian proposal to separate like CDN servers and the internet into 153 or 193 states. And it actually, countries were open to the idea, right? That has never happened before. You had countries just roundly dismiss that. So you have a turning away from the United States. And so that kind of rolls out at least the domestic policy, economic policy, and foreign policy, and then it Jamil is up and take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. I'll keep my my remarks very short so we can take more questions from you all and get to what you guys are interested in. I want to answer just a few of the things that Mark talked about. First, look, the notion that the SIGINT side dominates NSA, certainly true, but that's its primary mission. Its primary mission is to collect intelligence from signals, whether they're through the air or on a wire, and to get that information and share it with the rest of the government to help policymakers make decisions. So the collection of intelligence is a core part of the NSA mission, has been from day one when it started in the 1940s, right after World War II, and the way it ought to be. The encryption side is also critical. I wouldn't say that our encryption mission has suffered at all. I think to the contrary, we continue to invest tremendous amounts of money in ensuring that U.S. communications are secure, that the U.S. government is able to, and the Department of Defense is able to communicate securely across the board. And there are tremendous investments being made in that effort to help our communications not be cracked. Whether it's nuclear codes, as Tony Sager talked about earlier today, to just day-to-day tactical communications in the field. In addition, I would note that another primary function that NSA plays is providing cyber defense for the Department of Defense. And sharing that knowledge with the Department of Homeland Security so it can provide cyber defense to the rest of the government, and also try to share that information with the private sector so they can better defend themselves. And so a significant part of what NSA does is also this cyber defense side. We've seen things like the Defense Industrial Base pilot, where NSA took its collected signals intelligence data on cyber threats and shared it in a classified environment with the private sector, the Defense Industrial Base companies, to help them protect themselves from nation-state actors. I mean, there's an ongoing discussion. This whole debate about CISPA in Congress was about how to take the classified data the government is getting, high-end classified threat data, a lot like what you all collect on your networks, and how to share that effectively with the private sector to help the private sector better defend itself. And so that's an important part of the NSA mission too. That's actually probably the largest growing side of their mission, is collecting on cyber threats and protecting the Department of Defense and helping DHS protect the rest of the government. And then, of course, there's the new Cyber Command that's just been stood up in the last few years, whose responsibility is on behalf of the Department of Defense to win for the U.S. government in the cyber domain. We've seen cyber attacks by other nation states, not necessarily directed against us, although there have been some. But we saw the situation in Georgia with Russia, and we've seen nation-state actors come after us directly in an attack capacity, as well as a collection capacity. And so part of Cyber Command's mission is to defend against that and to provide us capabilities to respond if and when the president chooses to do so. So I don't think it's fair to say that the SIGINT side completely dominates these other missions. I think these other missions are important, they continue to be important, and they continue to grow, particularly on the cyber defense side. So that's one. I think on the economic policy side, it's important to remember that other nation states are engaged in economic warfare in the cyber domain against us. China in particular, other nation states too. They collect not just against the U.S. government, but they collect against our companies. They come after your core intellectual property to take it back to their countries, give it to their companies, and allow them to make products at a lower cost without the investment in R&D that we put in. Now, this is critically important because what's at the heart of the U.S. economic engine, the economic engine that you all are part of, is that R&D. It's that high-end technology that we're creating, that our innovation's creating, and if we lose that to nation-state actors who are willing to share it with their private sector, we're half, right? It's been said a number of times. I know it's sort of campy, but the truth is there are two kinds of companies in America today: the ones that have been hacked and know it, and the ones that have been hacked and just don't know it yet. Right? Everyone's been hacked, and almost every single one of your companies has been hacked, not just by your average script kiddies or anything like that. You've been hacked by nation states. Your core intellectual property is walking out the back door, and there's very little we can do about it. Now, the government shouldn't protect you. That's not the view of most people in the government. The view of the government is we have some information about what these threats look like, right? We live on the net. The government does, looking for cyber threats aimed at the government. But in doing so, we see cyber threats aimed at the private sector too. We should find a capability to share that data with the private sector to allow you all to do your jobs better and defend yourselves. So again, as I mentioned, that's an important economic policy thing that we can't discount. And then finally, on this issue of foreign policy, look, if the entire world did not know that we were collecting signal intelligence, I mean, you'd have to be an idiot, right? You'd have to be an idiot to not know the U.S. government has a massive intelligence collection apparatus, right? Both human intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery, you name it. We've done it all for a long time. We continue to do it. The notion that we wouldn't be surveilling foreign nation leaders, it's ridiculous, right? What should the intelligence community do but surveil foreign leaders? I mean, that's the mission of the intelligence community. Collect data on what foreigners and foreign nations are thinking so we can be ahead of those problems and protect our own national security. So, there's been a lot of sort of, there's a lot of hand-wringing out in Europe about the domination of America, the surveillance that we're conducting against all these nation states. But the truth of the matter is, they're doing it too. We're bigger, we're faster, we're better. True. I will say there are other nations that are very close to us in terms of their capabilities. You can guess who they are. But the truth is, and by the way, we share a lot with our allies. We share a lot of this data with our allies that we collect on other nation states that present threats to them, terrorists that present threats to them. So a lot of the people who today are hand-wringing and complaining about NSA surveillance are in particular the biggest beneficiaries of our surveillance and information we've shared with them to disrupt active terrorist plots in their countries. So, there's no doubt the disclosures that Edward Snowden has made have harmed our standing in the world, no doubt. But it's not like anybody didn't know we were collecting intelligence, nor should we not be collecting intelligence. It makes sense for our national security. So I'll leave it at that. Excited about hearing from you guys, your questions, and let's mix it up.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's a microphone right there if you want to walk up to it. That might be easier.
It's almost like a good cop, bad cop routine here.
I'm the bad cop, right?
Yeah. So my question was on the NSA. Is there a deep divide, like a left and right, in regards to the mass intelligence gathering? Are there people in NSA who believe we should not be doing it, like mass phone gatherings, email gatherings? Is there a division among NSA, or everybody is aligned to the notion that we just have to gather mass data?
I didn't hear the.
Repeat the question.
The echo is horrible.
Within the NSA, is there a divide, like left and right, to say that there are certain people who believe we should not be gathering information at a mass scale? I'm talking about internal. I don't care about foreign leaders, all those things. I'm talking about internal Verizon data, for example. Is there a deep divide in NSA that we should be doing it or not doing it?
So let me survive your question. Your question is there a divide within NSA about the topic of mass surveillance? Should they be doing it? Should they not be doing it? Is there a divide within NSA and the intelligence community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't work for the NSA, so I would not know. But I think, and especially what I have heard around it is that there is the light and dark side of NSA, right? There is this cryptologic side, and there's a signals intelligence side. And I think the tension is always there. It's just that I think this tension is skewed. It's skewed in the wrong way, and the balance is no longer there. I think in the 40s when it was first created by Truman, when it advanced through there, that balance was there, and I kind of think that the balance may have been lost.
So I think there's no doubt that there's always an ongoing debate within the government and within NSA about how much to collect and where to collect, and how to analyze it. Because the truth is, at the end of the day, even our very capable collection systems are finite. We have a finite amount of storage space. We have a finite amount of high performance computing power to analyze that data, and we have a finite number of analysts to translate and analyze the data and produce actually useful intelligence, right? So it's one thing to collect, it's another thing to analyze, process and analyze, and then report, right? And so there's no doubt there's always that question. And we talk a lot about mass surveillance, but the truth of the matter is, particularly when we talk about content collection, it is literally impossible, and it would be silly to collect everything or as much of everything as possible, because you simply can't process it fast enough. You can't find the things you're looking for if you collect too much, right? So our collection. What's that? No, I think that it wouldn't make sense, right? You of course you want to collect as much as your computing power will allow you to process and report on and disseminate, right? Because the more you collect, the more valuable information you can gather, right? So there's no doubt that you should try to get that envelope, but there is a finite limit, right? And it grows every day, just like computing power grows exponentially, right? Our capabilities to collect and process grows exponentially. At some point, we're limited by human capability to translate and analyze, right? And so there are very real limitations. The budget is not unlimited. It may be large, but it's not unlimited. And so it would not make sense. And nor does the NSA collect like that. They don't collect everything because it just doesn't make sense to do it that way. You've got to target your collection in a sensible way. And so the disclosures that have come out, the declassified information, what we found now is that, in fact, while you may have a beef about how much is collected or who's targeted, right? The reality is the collection is targeted, right? with the exception of the metadata, right, the untargeted metadata. But even that program, which collects the entire totality of the metadata, when you go into the database, you go in a targeted way, and you pull the string to get, what was 3 hops, now 2 hops. So even that collection, which itself, the collection is untargeted, the processing and analytics on it are very targeted. And so, I think it's important to sort of keep that in mind when we're talking about mass surveillance.
Yeah, I mean, it's also important that, that conversation that Jamil was having too focuses a lot on the post-acquisition process, right? We have seen that the initial targets, and especially around upstream where they are just collecting off the wire, a lot of it is just being deposited to that database. And so, we have to remember that there are 2 points of possession or acquisition into this, right? You have kind of that initial off the wire into these databases, then you have a second ingest into it.
Well, but even just real quick, even in that collection, right, what you're pulling off the wire is a targeted collection. You're not simply taking the entire totality off. It would be too much. If you're collecting on a backbone, you can't take everything.
Yes, but it depends on, especially around the specific target, right? We've seen targets that were so enormous that you had around 56, at least according to the Bates opinion, you had around 56,000 fully domestic emails being ingested because the targets for the upstream collection, the targets for this program was just too huge, right? And so I think it is a definitional semantic on targeted, right? And I think that's probably one of the fundamental differences that we have. And we saw it in the Section 215 debate where the bulk collection, everyone was using the term bulk collection. And we saw that the government defined bulk collection as collection without a target, collection without a phone number. You had one of those Verizon orders that said, we're going to collect all of these records from the business, and then we're going to ingest it. And now, the debate has shifted to, well, bulk collection, that's bulk collection. Targeted collection is as long as you have a term, as long as you have this selector. And the disagreement there is, I think on my side, that you can still have targets or you can still have selectors that are still too broad. And I think that the government would disagree with that and say, well, no, as long as you do have that target, as long as you do have that selector, you are minimizing information. It's not an overbroad search.
Okay. Sometimes I'm listening to the news and there's a pointed question. Are you listening to our phone calls? And I hear no. So is it ever a matter of semantics in that maybe audio files are transcribed into text, and then analytics are run on that text to deduce or infer information about the phone calls? I mean, and then technically, I'm not listening to your phone calls, but I'm transcribing text and running analytics on that text. And if you look at, I guess, the evolution of technology, and it's like the whole tip and ring, the whole it's being replaced. The analog infrastructure for phones where you used to have to basically tap a line. Yeah. You know what I mean? So now even that, in order to at the switch box, you've got, voice over frame relay, even that has an IP to it. So at some point, even the wire, you're able to collect that in a packetized form. And once again, if it's translated to text, technically I'm not listening to it, but if I can read the transcript, is there, what I mean? Is that a possibility?
Yeah. So the answer to your question is this, which is that the way that NSA and the government thinks about it is not, are we listening to an audio file, a voice file, or are we collecting the text of the communication, whether it's an email or transcribing the text? It's simply content collection versus non-content collection, right? So non-content collection is what we all think of as metadata, right? The 215 program about telephony and internet metadata. Content collection is the contents of the communication, whether that's a voice phone call, right? The packetized deep packet inspection type data that you would look into inside the payload of the packet, right? Or the actual text of an email, right? And so that's how the government thinks about it. Content versus non-content. And so I don't think people are playing the semantic game of we're not listening to your phone calls, but we're transcribing it and reading your email and reading the text of it. They collect, no doubt, they collect content. They have authorization to collect content. The 702 program, right, which is foreigners overseas, is a content collection program. The traditional FISA, where you go to the FISA court to collect inside the United States or against an American anywhere in the world, you have to get a court order, right? That's content collection. The metadata collection is this 215, the business records order, the pen, register, and trap trace statute, and that's where you look for either patterns or you look for communications so that you can figure out, okay, what signal do I want to go after for content collection based on the metadata connections.
But to my point, if I ask you a question, I said, are you listening to my phone calls? And you tell me no, but then there's still a possibility that you're analyzing the text.
I don't know if other people would do that. I would not play that semantic game with you, right? If you ask me, are you under content surveillance, or are you being, I would take your question, are you listening to my phone calls as am I engaged in content surveillance against you? That's how I take it. Now, other people may play that game. I'm not saying that, and, I'll give you an example, right? So when the Bush administration disclosed the terrorist surveillance program, right? It was disclosed by the New York Times, right? And then it was declassified. When they used the term, when I was the Bush administration, used the term terrorist surveillance program, it was limited to the activities described by the president, which was at one end U.S., one end foreign, one end terrorist, one end not. It did not go into the entirety of the president's surveillance program, which we now know today, it's been declassified, included telephony and internet metadata. And so there was a case where the government, because all that was disclosed publicly in the New York Times story was the content collection program, they talked about TSP, right, as that category, even though there were other aspects to it, right, that were never fully disclosed until recently after Snowden and after the government declassified. So it's not to say the government doesn't play semantic games, people do, but if you were to ask me, or this is my phone calls, I wouldn't play semantic game. I'd just tell you content surveillance versus non-content.
Roger that, thanks.
So what I'm pretty much listening, when I listen to mass surveillance, for me, I guess I have this image of an officer on a street smelling someone smoking pot. And he's kicking in every door in the hopes that hopefully he finds the house where the smoke is emanating from. In law enforcement, local law enforcement, if an officer comes to your house, opens the door, and there is a pipe smoking with marijuana in it, it's exigent circumstances. I guess my question is the NSA, Homeland Security, exempt from exigent circumstances, and that's why they can do the mass surveillance?
So no, as against U.S. persons, which is to say U.S. citizens or permanent residents, right, inside the United States, or even abroad actually now under the FISA Amendments Act, the U.S. government cannot collect on you without a court order, period, full stop. It is illegal to collect against an American anywhere in the world without a court order. So there's no mass surveillance for Americans. Now, no, so that's not, so when I'm talking about content collection, to be clear, I'm talking about the contents of your communication, right? Metadata is different. You're right. Under the metadata program, the government takes the entirety of the metadata from the providers it goes to with these 215 orders, and then asks for permission to go in and ping the data, right? Pull the data out, right? So you're right to say that on the non-content side, that's how it's done. On the content collection side, however, the government is not authorized. It is unlawful to collect against an American anywhere in the world without a court order.
So,
And so I'll just interrupt there and sorry, but while it may be unlawful, what we have been seeing though is that this is the intentional collection aspect of the statute, and that even though you have the targets and these certifications, there are still collections on Americans, and that inadvertent collections on Americans. And I think that's what.
Sure. So of course, right? There's what's called incidental collections. So for example, take the traditional.
Like,
no. Let me explain. Let me explain.
Kicking in the doors from the other neighbors.
Hold on. But let me. Sure. No. Let me. Let me explain. Let me explain what incidental collection is. Okay. So in the traditional Title III context, right, or traditional wiretap context, where you go to a court and get a court order to surveil a telephone, right? When you're collecting on a given telephone number or an email address, you're going to get everything that target gets, right? You're going to be listening to all their phone calls. Now, in the criminal context, what we do is when we're on a phone call, we turn the collection off if we hear it's not relevant, right? The sort of the typical like mafia, right? You're listening and they're talking about the weather, right? You guys remember that scene in Casino, right, where the wives are talking for a little while, and then as soon as they know the FBI's turned off, the guys get on the phone and talk about the business. So in the criminal context, that's how we do it, and so we minimize in that way. We minimize our collection, but you are always going to get collection on the person that's not the target. You're always going to get the other communicant, right? That's how communications collection works. There's always two ends of a phone call. You're only targeting one person. You're not targeting both ends. So you're always going to get the calls they make to the other person's content. Same thing in the foreign context, right? You're collecting against a foreigner. You're going to get that foreigner's communications where they communicate with another foreigner or an American. Well, what do we do to protect Americans' privacy in that context? We minimize, right? We try to avoid collecting directly on Americans. It is unlawful to target an American for surveillance without a court order. And then when you do collect it on an American, you've got to redact out their name, any identifying information, and you can't keep it if it's not foreign intelligence information. You have to get rid of it. And if you realize you collected domestic communications unintentionally, you're required to get rid of it altogether. So there are protections in place, but incidental collection happens in every surveillance context. It is impossible to not do because there's two ends to every communication, and maybe more.
And what Jamil's pointing to right now, so this is one of the fundamental disagreements, right, we would have, where we would say, and we do say, when you look at these minimization procedures, I think I have to unravel a couple things there. One, foreign intelligence information. The definition of foreign intelligence information is quite broad. You have information that includes really anything relating to foreign affairs, anything related to national security. And we've seen those terms used to collect on and keep and retain tons of excess information. The second point are these minimization procedures. Now, the minimization procedures, they were first released by The Guardian. The government has declassified I believe the 2011 minimization procedures. And when you look at these minimization procedures, I think one of the core issues is that they are intended to over-retain and over-collect. They use the foreign intelligence information definition to keep information that is just either not of the target or completely unnecessary. And actually, IOB report, there are Intelligence Oversight Board reports where, something that we were very cautious of and something we were concerned on with the minimization procedures is that the minimization procedures have exemptions for when you can keep Americans' communications. And some of these exemptions are if you need it for traffic analytic purposes, right? Or if it's encrypted, if it's ciphertext. And when we looked about it, when we thought about it, well, traffic analytic, any communication can be retained for traffic analytic purposes. And what we found out later is that in a FOIA request from the Intelligence Oversight Board, an example that we saw in a report, this is a few years ago, this is about 2009, 2010 in one of these oversight reports, is that exactly what we feared happened, where we saw a collection go on that on content, on phone calls of an American. They got it, they retained it, it was in the database, and then they called forth these exceptions of the minimization procedures to keep the communication, keep the content of it. And so, this is one of the very important things where the minimization procedures, it's a statute, right? So there are statutory guidelines, and Congress passes statutory guidelines for what minimization procedures are. And we're seeing that used in the context of the collection programs and used in the context of the upstream collection and Section 02 program, that the minimization procedures, from my viewpoint, are not doing the job, right? They are intended to overcollect, they're intended to over-retain, and you are having innocent people, right? This goes back to the Washington Post analysis of the communications. You're having tons of excess information that has nothing to do with the target, and that has nothing to do with the mission being retained and kept, and then being fed to FBI, CIA, and CTC. And that it's a huge problem, and I think it's a fault of the minimization procedures, and it's a fault of the new collection techniques that we've seen starting in 2008.
I have a question concerning liability. So looking into the past, there were other data collection initiatives in different countries, including the US, of the citizens. Assuming now that you are collecting data on US citizens or US residents, and assuming that what you said before, that computers getting more powerful, analytics is getting more and more better, and the storage space is getting larger and larger. So the answer to the gentleman is more or less yes. What would you think that in the next government or the next to next government, a new McCarthy is coming and declaring that teddy bears are terrorists and are starting to spying and extracting all the people who own teddy bears or cats or being communists or Jew?
So I think the answer to that is, what are the mechanisms to ensure that doesn't happen, right? And so in the first instance, all of this collection takes place under statutory authority, right? Under legal authority provided by Congress and signed by the president. So the traditional FISA collection takes place under that statute that was passed in 1978. The 702 collection takes place under a statute passed in 2008, right? The 215. All these programs that we're aware of all take place under statutory authority, with the exception of 12333 collection, which, as you point out, takes place under this executive order. Now, what happens with that collection when it comes in, right? Who watches the watcher, right? Who watches NSA, right? So in the first instance, it's the FISA court, right? And there's been a lot of discussion, I think, in the media and publicly, and a lot of debates about
it's a secret court, isn't it?
What's that?
It's a secret court.
It's a secret court.
So
that's
very
right.
Good, yeah.
That's right. So it's
that helps.
What's that?
That helps.
Yeah. So of course it's a problem because you have a secret court, right? So how are we supposed to know what they're doing, right? And I think the answer to that is the following: look, you're collecting foreign intelligence. If that proceeding weren't secret, then everybody would know what you're collecting and who you're collecting against, right? That clearly, you can't do intelligence collection that way, right? You can't tell people you're surveilling who you're surveilling, otherwise they'll simply move their collection, move their communications capacity, right? So it doesn't. So by its nature, if we're going to talk about intelligence collection, we're going to talk about having a court involved, it has to take place in a classified setting. But how can you have faith that classified setting isn't corrupt and isn't a problem, right? I think there are a few ways to do that. Number one, so you have this court in place. The judges who are part of that court are regular, everyday district court judges from around the country, right? They're not specialized judges who only sit on the FISA court. They're regular district court judges around the country. They themselves are overseen by an appellate court, which is overseen by the Supreme Court, right? So if a company or a provider wanted to appeal a order that was given, it could. And as we found out in the Yahoo context, they did. They went to the FISA court when they were directed to conduct surveillance of the Protect America Act. They fought. They lost. They took an appeal up to the FISA court. They lost there. They chose not to appeal to the Supreme Court. Okay. So there are those procedures. In addition, the congressional intelligence committees, also in a classified setting, conduct oversight of these things, and they take all the reports that come in. There are these semi-annual reports that the government provides to both the court and to the Congress. And members of Congress, their staffs review this and engage in conversations with the intelligence community about what's going on, why are there these oversight problems, and how do you know it actually works? If you look at the Bates opinions, right, where they found this overcollection, as you were talking about, you know where that overcollection, where the court found out about that from? Self-reporting. NSA found the problem in their gear. They found the mistake they were making, reported it to the court. The court ordered them to end that collection, terminate that collection until they had procedures in place to avoid that type of collection. Congress was aware of it. We conducted oversight of it. Now, you're right. It's hard to have faith in that because it's classified. So we in the government have to do a better job of declassifying more information and giving you more. So you've seen now, post-Snowden, there's been a lot more documents about what we collect, how we collect, about court opinions being declassified. It's not enough. We should do more. You know, for a long time, we kept 215, the entire 215 program, highly classified, and it was thought it was one of the crown jewels of the collection capability, as it turns out. And the fear was that if you disclose the 215 program, you'd lose the collection. But as it turns out, it's impossible to lose that collection because, like, how are you going to avoid 215, right? You just don't call it to the United States, right? That's the only way to avoid it. Otherwise, so it's really, so the concern that we thought about 215 being disclosed was really actually not problematic. Now, on the content collection side, 702, it is problematic if you disclose a lot of details about the surveillance because, as we've seen with terrorist targets, they will change their methods and patterns, and they have. In response to the Snowden disclosures, both our foreign intelligence enemies, our nation states that we go after, and terrorists have changed their patterns of behavior. And that's a problem because it's harder for us to collect on them.
I have 2 points.
The answer is due to lack of transparency, things will grow, we will collect more, and in the future there will be McCarthy going for other people.
Well,
I think the lack of transparency is really the biggest problem you have.
I think you're right. We need to be more transparent and more open about what we do and how we do it.
Sorry, you won't. Next Snowden will come, and then you will say the same thing again, and the next Snowden will come, and you will say the same thing again. So
I think there are two very important points, especially when it comes to the FISA court and self-reporting. I mean, in that same, though, release of that opinion, the judge, one of the chief judges also said that we rely too heavily on the NSA for the self-reporting, and we simply don't have the facilities, we don't have the necessary capabilities to oversee all of this.
The court itself.
The court itself,
That's
yeah.
right. That's right.
And so, I think that is one of the counters to that, where the FISA court is, it's the secretive court, it's ex parte, so it's, just with the government, and that may change with the USA Freedom Act, where an amicus, someone else will be introduced into this. But, especially around the FISA court, the ex parte manner and the self-reporting is one of the problems. And you have that reliance on it. You also have the reliance on the intelligence committees. And we've heard a lot about, we've heard Representative Amash, we've heard, Leahy and Grassley joke about these classified briefings and the oversight and the difficulties in that, and how it's a game of 20 questions and they don't really get that much information. Jamil definitely has some insight on that as a former staffer on there, but it's a meme that happens and it's among senators. So I think it's something to combat, and it's part of this complexity, right? The complexity is breeding complacency when it comes to these programs, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for the overseers and people who are supposed to be representing Americans in that room to figure out what's going on, figuring out what's being collected, figuring out what's being shared. It takes a lot of people, and this touches on a larger larger problems with the classification system, and how easily it is to classify things and how easily it is to not find out what's going on.
I would like to know how the NSA paying off the RSA to default on a intentionally flawed cryptographic algorithm furthers the supposed mission of strengthening our domestic infrastructure.
Yeah, you know, I've seen those same reports you've seen. I don't know whether they're true or not, to be frank with you. What's that? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that a lot of companies contract with NSA for provision of services, right? I don't know the truth of that allegations. I can't intelligently comment on it. But certainly, you know, some of our best encryption comes from the private sector and comes from you all, right? Some of the hardest to break encryption out there. There's no doubt that the U.S. government seeks to break foreign encryption. That's part of NSA's mission, right? And it seeks to encrypt our own government systems better. Weakening cryptography is net bad for privacy. There's no doubt about that. But the government, of its nature, does seek to break encryption overseas against foreign targets. So, as it should, right? I mean, they encrypt their communications to keep them from us. We encrypt our communications to keep them from them. That's part of the system. But I just don't know whether that report is true or not. So,
we have to actually end. So, no, we have to. I think we're over time.
We'll stay around.
Yeah, we'll
stay around if people want to ask questions.
Yeah.
Or...
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. Sure. All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.